Hello, friends. We're continuing our conversation today about overcoming racial disparities, especially in clinical trials. And when it comes to patient recruitment, a company like 83Bar is utilizing both technology and techniques to expand the reach of the clinical trial recruitment. And I'm so happy to be talking with Kate Hermans, who is the Chief Business Officer for Pharma at 83Bar. Kate, glad to be talking to you.
Oh, Mark, I am so excited to be here. This is a topic that is so close and near and dear to my heart. So thank you for the opportunity. I'm really looking forward to it.
Yes. And you've put together a nice presentation that overviews some of the background and some of the data, as well as some of the approaches that 83Bar can take to help overcome these disparities. And I appreciate you walking us through it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'd like to give a quick shout out to a friend who provided to me some of the data. They will know who they are when they see this presentation. So just a huge thanks. I really wanted to take time to talk about this concept of advancing health equity through R&D. And I'd love to talk, Mark, you had sent me some questions in advance. I'd love to start first by talking about what is the current situation. There's a wonderful quote that was made by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation that really talks about health equity being fair and just opportunity to be as healthy as possible, made available to everyone. And I think actually this slide I love is a great representation of that. Is that not everyone in our population is starting from the same place. So if you give everyone equal access to the same resources, they're still not able to necessarily take advantage of all of the health resources out there. And in this particular case, we're talking about clinical trials. But on the right, if you actually disproportionately think through what resources different populations need, then everybody can reach the apple and everyone can participate in clinical trials. And I'll share with you a little bit as we kind of go through why that's so important. I think I want to start first with maybe sharing some data. Everyone hears about health inequity, but I really think that the data kind of sets you through. If you happen to look here, you can see that there are absolute disparities, even at age-adjusted death rates across several different key disease states here. And it's just whites and blacks in comparison to some of the other ethnicities are just disproportionately affected. And so thinking through that and those participants in trials is going to be super important. And then maybe bringing it closer to home, since we've all had the fun of spending lots of time at home over the last year during the pandemic. There was a lot of talk in the news, and the data really kind of supports that Black and Indigenous Americans were experiencing much higher death tolls from COVID-19 than maybe other races. And I think the real sad thing is that if everyone had died of COVID-19 at the same actual rate as white Americans, we would have thousands more people still alive today. So there's definitely things that could be done to give greater access, broader inclusivity, and eventually improved outcomes. So I'd love to share that with you if I could. So here is the reality that we face today. Addressing the issue of equity really requires starting early on in the development and eventually research space, and making sure that minorities and women have equal opportunity to participate. I think maybe because I'm female, the one that caught my attention is heart disease is the #1 killer of women. And yet women only make up 38% of all participants. There was research done that actually went back and looked at 740 different trials. There were more than 800,000 participants, and still only 38% participated from the gender, women gender. But you can see it, African Americans, Hispanics, all disproportionately underrepresented in clinical trials. The good news is that there are lots of things that can be done to fix this. There are lots of wonderful examples of how we can impact this reality and make changes to it. And I think that the reasons to do so are multifold. Scientifically, studying, you mentioned this before, we actually started recording the call. There are just different ways in which different populations show up. So understanding what those factors are that affects their disease or health is super important. Ethnically, to make sure that everyone is getting equitable treatment. And then financially, there's a huge reason to make sure that you've got the right level of inclusiveness in trials. That's going to affect drug uptake, utilization, labeling, and ultimately revenue for sure. And so there's a ton that has been studied. In fact, there was a publication done by the Kellogg Foundation that reported that by eliminating disparities by the year 2050, would yield an economic gain of more than $230 billion a year. So if no other reason pops on this slide to do it, the financial reason is a huge reason to focus on the disparities that exist today. But there is a lot of published data on this. Different treatments are required by different populations. They've got different risks. They've got different markers for different disease states. And as a result, not all drugs, just by virtue of the drug themselves, is going to be equally effective or safe in all populations. And it's super important for physicians to know which drugs are going to work in which populations the best, so that they can provide the best treatment for patients possible. And then coming back to my COVID-19 example, we've actually done a lot as an industry, which is phenomenal, to really try and infuse diversity into the vaccination trials. But as you can see here, there is definitely still room to ensure that enrollment diversity is consistent with the proportion of all minorities in the population. So we've come a long way, a lot more that we could potentially do. And maybe I can share with you, Mark, some of the steps that could be taken to help make that happen. And I really believe that it's going to require a bit of shift in our thinking, because there are barriers to enrolling a diverse population of patients. Some of them are talked about, maybe some of them aren't fully understood. But the shift really can start early on in the discovery process, all the way through the clinical trial design process at every phase of clinical trial. We have an opportunity to make sure that the design and the requirements don't exclude minority patients, that we're including the voice of the community in the trial, that we are locating sites near where the populations that need to participate in our trials are located, and that we really can customize that outreach and that patient recruiting based on the target population's location, their needs, their sources of information, and even their sources of trust. So I'd love to share with you a little bit about what we've done at 83 Bar to try and help make that shift in thinking possible for some of our clients. So at 83 Bar, we have a wonderful combination of technology and a decentralized RN clinical contact center that has been designed very purposefully with several key priorities. First and foremost, we have designed from the patient forward. Our entire goal is to improve the user experience for all patients, regardless of where they are, what their backgrounds are, to make sure that they have equal opportunity to participate in the trials in which we're able to support. There's a whole host of other things: speed, flexibility, configurability, and then of course, all of the necessary QMS, privacy, security, et cetera, things are in play. But for us, really the opportunity to be able to go find patients where they are in the real world and help to quickly navigate them on their journey to a clinical trial site is something that we get enormous joy out of as a company. And some of the data that we're able to collect really kind of speaks to that. the ability to kind of track success against whatever a particular clinical trial's goals might be. In this particular trial's case, it was really important for us to make sure that we had a pretty broad representation of patients in there. So you can see in this particular case, having the 50-50 gender split, real world ethnic representation that was driven by both by prevalence as well as the percentage of each in our population, low income housing, public insurance, and rural areas. All based on this particular disease and the populations that we needed to reach. We were able to capture the real-time demographics tracking to make sure that this trial stayed on track while hitting all of those goals. And we were really able to optimize our prospective patient targeting to meet those study requirements. So this is just one example of what we're able to do. And I'm super excited to be part of a company that is really able to help maybe shift that impact that I was talking about earlier. So thanks, Mark, for the opportunity to kind of share that.
Absolutely. And let's drill down on a couple of these points, if I could. And that's, we can start scientifically. You mentioned that, sometimes the inclusion and exclusion criteria in and of itself has and I'm sure unconscious, but a scientifically unconscious bias because it's giving parameters that may not reflect real world patient, profiles.
Yeah, I mean, the different populations just have different markers that are going to be important to pay attention to. So when you have a disease like cardiovascular disease or what have you, super important to pay attention to what those markers are across the populations and make sure that your inclusion and exclusion criteria aren't unintentionally excluding the participation of those populations when in fact disproportionately those populations may be actually overrepresented in a particular disease. So those are just the kind of things that you need to pay attention to.
That's great.
Yeah.
So Kate, maybe I can have you unshare here for a second and we'll go back to full screen.
Yeah.
Great. Well, let's continue some of these thoughts then that have been presented. And I think when you were talking about the proportionality of the incidence of some of these diseases, you look at cardiovascular, you looked at cancer, you looked at diabetes, for example. And in all of these cases, there was some underrepresentation. And again, I think dissecting that in the 3 or 4 different ways you did, what specifically could be done to smooth out those representation levels?
Yeah, so I think that starting from discovery all the way forward, so preclinical, clinical studies, I think you need to have a purposeful approach to defining what percentage of populations you want to include in your clinical trial. You then need to make sure that the inclusion and exclusion criteria, as you highlighted a few moments ago, don't unintentionally exclude a population that you really want to study. And then I think you need to make sure you're purposeful in your recruitment. And that's going to look and feel a variety of different ways. Different populations get information about clinical trials in different places. There are different levels of trust based on those sources of information. And I think making sure that you don't have a one size fits all or it's always been done this particular way kind of approach is important, because I think, we know that the way it's been done before got us to underrepresentation unintentionally. And so really changing the ways in which we do things, I think, can help. I think we talked about cardiovascular as one example. I think that, that's the case even in myelomas, for example, where you have people of color who are underrepresented. Every disease state, every therapeutic area has different needs across the populations. And I think we have an opportunity to kind of take them one by one.
And I think one of the, if we could go to another category, and that's just some practical realities. Sometimes trials are recruiting only in the existing referral patterns or in clinics, within a health system or something. And doesn't 83 Bar try to, again, expand that outreach outside the current referral patterns?
Yeah, the beauty of what we do is we find that about 98% of patients are actually finding our ad sets on their mobile phone. So even if this is the only computer that someone owns, they have the ability to have equal access. And then it's about advertising on the platforms where your target populations are likely to be, so that they have equal access to the ad sets that we have floating through the different social media channels, paid search, et cetera. And then from there, it's making sure that you have ad sets that are going to be appealing to the different populations so that you're not disproportionately pushing away a particular population due to imagery or to wording that may not be favorable. And then I think, the education piece of what we do is so important as well. So when a patient comes to a landing page and helping to educate them and helping them to feel like it's a credible thing, it's bona fide, is super important. And then I think the way in which you design your survey, we definitely take this into consideration, is utilizing patient language. Not everyone has the same understanding or exposure to medical terminology. So being able to design your surveys in patient-friendly language so that everyone can answer the surveys, which are designed based on inclusion and exclusion criteria, you're again making equal opportunity, equitable opportunity for all. And then last but not least is, in our case, is having an RN staffed clinical education specialist center that is really hired certainly based on their credibility, but based on empathy and the ability to meet different people, different populations, kind of wherever they are in their journey. And some people are well aware of clinical trials, other people not so aware, and the importance of being able to educate on what it means to participate in a clinical trial. What are those expectations in that protocol of a particular population? And already thinking through what the impact of those requirements may be on different populations, and ensuring, working with our clients, that they may have the right resources in place to kind of support those populations to be able to participate.
Mm-hmm. And, we were talking about the various implications, certainly for the companies, certainly for the scientific research, but even though just in our nomenclature, we say patients, we say subjects, we say trial participants, but these are people. And I was curious, from an 83 Bar, you mentioned the empathy of the RNs, but even for the company's purpose of accelerating, a patient journey and managing it better, what do you think it means to people to have access to these treatments, especially at a clinical trial level?
Oh, it's huge, right? So participation in clinical trials means having access to the latest and greatest medicines or devices or diagnostics to really help them improve their own personal healthcare journey and health outcomes. It may mean having access to things that they would otherwise not have access to, which is also super important. And then I think, different people have different questions, different frames of reference about what it means to participate in a clinical trial. So having that personalized interaction, which we can do at scale, but make sure that every person gets their questions answered that they need to have answered, that really just levels the playing field for everyone to participate.
It's great. And I talked to a group of, site operators and coordinators, and they were very much saying, look, if we can get this out of the ivory tower, enough white papers and publications and policy statements and get it to the real world and the ground level, what do you think 83 Bar can do to really operationalize some of these, otherwise lofty goals and theories?
Yeah, I think it's several things, Mark. I think it's first understanding. So when we get the opportunity to work with a client, we often recommend doing a protocol feasibility study. And we are able to test a client's protocol in the real world and immediately understand who we're reaching and where the barriers might be. So we have the ability to kind of test that and maybe flag where a protocol could potentially be enhanced to make sure you're going to have equitable representation. We're also going to highlight where there may be some challenges in terms of resource needs for the different populations. And that could be, folks who are living in rural areas and don't necessarily have access to the clinical trial sites. It could be people who need transportation, or maybe someone needs the support of a caregiver through the process, depending on the disease. And then likewise, even just having that education, that information. And so our process really just starts from the protocol itself. We have a team full of really talented folks who will go through and look at that protocol and who we need to be recruiting. And then design a campaign that's completely tailored for that particular protocol, that takes into consideration all of those different factors, the populations, the disease, the resources available, the difficulty or ease of recruiting. And we'll make recommendations to clients on how to do that even better and more effectively. And then all of the things that we just talked about a few moments ago kind of get added on as icing on the cake.
Yeah, terrific. Well, Kate, what a great conversation. You've really given us a sense of the data behind the situation, and the practical steps that we can take, and the vision. And maybe you could summarize for us then, the last few minutes of conversation, basically the where we are to where we want to be. What's the current situation, and how do you see a better way forward?
So I think today we have unequitable representation and access to clinical trials. I think we've taken great strides as a collective we in the industry to try and make changes to that. And you see that. I think there's opportunity to do even more. And I think from an 83 bar standpoint, where we can help companies do that more and have that greater impact, is really focusing on recruiting the right patients based on the disease prevalence, based on the populations that you want to attract, and based on the trial design. Attract them quickly, educate them based on where they are in their journey, and really help to connect them into a clinical trial site quickly. I think that does several things. One is you make sure you've got the right people in the right trial at the right time. You are delivering the right people, regardless of population, to a trial site in a highly pre-qualified way. So it makes it much easier for the clinical trial coordinators to do their job and quickly get patients enrolled into trial sites. And then on the back end, you are hitting your trial goals in terms of timelines and getting medicines to market that are going to have the right representation in those trials, that make it super easy to give physicians the data they need to know who to prescribe that drug for, or that device, or that diagnostic. So on the back end of all of this, the right patient is getting the right treatment in the right way. So I think that's what we can do.
It's a good vision to look forward to. Thank you for sharing that. I've been talking with Kate Hermans. She is the Chief Business Officer for Pharma at 83 Bar, the patient activation company. You can learn more at 83bar.com. Thanks, Kate.
Thanks, Mark.